she's just
people away actually because it's too full.
Okay. Have we got no space on mats at the back?
Standing room at the back. It's
Right.
not really open.
God, it's amazing. It's amazing. But
Pushing extra benches. It's not really.
so welcome all of you, and thank you for being patient. We're just getting the video equipment sorted because this talk's going to be on YouTube on Monday, so it will reach a wider audience. The talk tonight is being hosted by Earthquakes, which is an Extinction Rebellion affinity group, and we're hoping that more affinity groups will form after this talk. If people who are in the Earthquakes could put their hands up, please. If at the end of the talk you want to talk to any of us about any of the issues raised or about forming affinity groups, please come to us. Particular welcome on this soggy February evening. It's absolutely packed. In fact, we're now turning people away, which shows how momentum has built, and this time is ripe for Extinction Rebellion. The meeting aims to be over by just after 9. We will have flyers hopefully at the end which we can hand out, which will say about a Quaker Peace Talk, which is at the Wills building. It will, in the same theme, it will be talking about, so it's the annual Quaker lecture, it will be talking about the Nonviolent Direct Action training, which the Earthquakes Affinity Group will be setting up on the 1st of March, which you're all welcome to come to. From that, normally at the end of the Nonviolent Direct Action training, affinity groups are formed, but please talk to us. Tonight won't be a barrel of laughs, but it will be fascinating, thought-provoking, and hopefully action-provoking too. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Colin Davies and also, I don't know where, Tom Dalton as well. Tom Dalton is an Extinction Rebellion activist. Professor Colin Davies, some of you will have heard about already. I'm not going to talk more because we're late already, but welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and I'd really like to thank the Redland Quakers for hosting this evening. I really appreciate that. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on a cold, wet evening at the end of the week to listen to a talk about a scary subject. That's a minor act of bravery in itself, so thank you very much. As Joe said, my name's Colin, and
my name's Tom. Yeah, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. It is really good to see so many people here. It's just really kind of quite humbling to see how much the Extinction Rebellion has grown and how many people are now really interested and coming to talks. And yeah, thank you all very much.
Yeah, so Tom and I are members of a group called Rising Up, which is the group that's organising the Extinction Rebellion. And we're going to do a bit of a double act tonight. The talk that we're going to give is our version of a talk that has been given over 100 times across the UK and now around the world. And the talk has two parts. I'm going to do part one, which is about where we're heading. And then Tom will take part two, which is about what to do about it. And in a way, I feel like I've drawn the short straw here because where we're heading is a somewhat gloomy topic. There are radical aspects to both parts of this talk, and that might be more immediately apparent when Tom is talking about civil disobedience in the second part. But actually, to my mind, the really radical part of this talk is the first part, because it turns on its head the conventional wisdom about how one is supposed to do climate communication. according to that approach, one mustn't be too scary, one mustn't be negative. There's even a formula which says that for every one piece of negative information, you must have 3 pieces of positive information. You have to have a positive framing. You say things like, by cycling instead of driving, you can not only reduce your CO2 emissions, but you can save money and get fit at the same time. And that's all very well, but when we do that, we tend to tiptoe around the climate crisis, and we avoid looking at it directly. And by contrast, in this talk, I want to encourage you to actually face up to the truth of our situation and to think about not only the facts about climate change, but also what those facts mean, what the implications are for you, for those you love, for all the people around the world, for our descendants, and for the other species that we share this earth with. So the basic premise of this talk is to tell the truth and to act as if that truth were real. But the truth is scary, and you may find yourself experiencing some strong emotions during this part of the talk. You might find you feel sadness, possibly anger. You may feel fear. And what I want to say about that is that those are perfectly natural and appropriate reactions to this subject. And in fact, I'd like to encourage you to allow yourself to have those feelings and to sit with them. Because to do so is to start a kind of grieving process which is necessary to move us from denial to a more adaptive coping strategy. The other thing I'd say is that you are safe here. Climate change isn't going to harm you tonight. There are lots of people here who you can talk to, as Joe said, people who've also been profoundly affected by this subject and who will listen to you. So please do come and talk to us afterwards. And then also, I do want to emphasize that you are not helpless, you are not powerless, that when we join together, we do have power, we do have some control over our destiny. We can change things. There are things we can do, and Tom in the second part is going to tell us about what he and I and other members of the Extinction Rebellion are doing. Okay, so you will probably have heard something about the report that came out in October. It was published by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The newspaper headlines screamed that we have 12 years to limit climate change catastrophe. The background to this report was that we signed up, the UK and other countries signed up in 2015 to the Paris Agreement, which says that we will attempt to keep warming well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and aim for 1.5 degrees. But people at that point didn't have a good understanding of exactly what the difference was between the consequences of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. So scientists were tasked with trying to determine what the implications of those different temperatures are. So that's what they studied for this report, and the conclusion was that 2 degrees is much, much worse in terms of its effects on hundreds of millions of people. So the report says that we must aim to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And what that means is that we have a carbon budget. We cannot afford to burn all the fossil fuels that we already have. let alone try to find more. We have to keep lots of our carbon in the ground. And notwithstanding these 12-year headlines that you may have seen, the message is that we have to act now. The longer we delay, the more CO2 we pump into the atmosphere, the steeper the cuts that we have to make. So this is really urgent. And to underline that, if you look at what the scientists said following the release of the report, Deborah Roberts, who's co-chair of the Impacts Committee, said, what this says is we must act now. This is the largest clarion bell from the science community. I hope it mobilizes people and dents the mood of complacency. The executive director of the UN Environment Programme said it's like a deafening, piercing smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. We have to put out the fire. So there's no ambiguity about the message that is coming from scientists. So I want to briefly review a little bit about the science, just so we can understand why this problem is so urgent, what it is that is scaring scientists so much. So how close are we to 1.5 degrees? Well, that's this orange line here, and we're currently at about 1 degree above pre-industrial levels. And if we were to follow this dotted line, then we would get to 1.5 degrees in about 2040. So that's how long it would take if we follow a straight line. However, the recent history of global warming shows that we're not following straight lines. Everything is accelerating. And when we talk about 1.5 degrees, that might not seem like so much. I mean, if the temperature in this room were to go up by 1.5 degrees, then people wouldn't be particularly adversely affected. But in a complex, self-regulating dynamic system, 1.5 degrees has a very large impact. So in the last ice age, the global mean temperature was 4 degrees below the pre-industrial levels. And the world was a very different place then. The other thing to note about this is that that refers to global temperatures. It's not saying that it's going to be 1.5 degrees everywhere around the world. So if we look at the temperature now, then there are places where the temperature is already well above 1.5 degrees, above pre-industrial. There are some places where it's got colder. So here in the ocean, it's actually colder because the ice from the Arctic has melted, and that very cold water is now mixing in the ocean. It's actually above the Arctic that we have seen the highest rates of warming. And that means that the Arctic ice is melting rapidly. Sorry that this isn't as clear as it could be, but this shows what has happened to the volume of Arctic ice from 1980 to roughly the present. And what we're actually plotting here is how much ice there is at the minimum. There's a cycle in the Arctic ice, so in the winter, the water freezes, we get more ice, and then as the temperature warms up over the course of the year, some of the ice melts, and so we have a minimum around September. And so what we're plotting is how much that minimum was in 1980 down to the present, and what you can see is we've gone from about 16,000 cubic kilometers of ice to about 4,000 cubic kilometers now. And that has happened much more rapidly than scientists anticipated. You can see you can't draw a straight line through that. It's been accelerating. This plot shows you what the IPCC projections had been, what the models suggested. The models suggest that by the year 2100, we should still have a September minimum ice. There should still be plenty of ice in September. But, I mean, looking at this graph, you can see it's not going to be too long before we get down to zero, maybe 2025. Why have the models got it wrong? Well, it's because they haven't satisfactorily incorporated some of the non-linear aspects of this process, some of the feedback loops. This is one of the things that particularly worries scientists. So one of those feedback loops is something called the albedo effect. This is a phenomenon that we all understand. It's why if you go out on a hot summer's day wearing a black t-shirt, then you'll warm up more than if you wear a white t-shirt, because the white will cause the sun's rays to be reflected back off into space, whereas the black will absorb more heat. And that's what happens with the ice. As the ice melts, it turns to dark ocean water, which is then able to absorb more heat, which causes the ice to melt faster, and you get into a loop, a kind of a vicious cycle. That's one example of a feedback loop, but there are many. Another one concerns the Amazonian rainforest, which has been a great carbon sink and has been absorbing billions of cubic feet of CO2 every year. But as the temperature increases, the forest dries out, we get forest fires, and then instead of being a sink, the forest starts to produce CO2, causing the temperature to rise, and once again, we get a feedback loop. Another concept that climate scientists talk about is the idea of tipping points. So we can look at the Earth's geological record and see that our climate system has different stable states. So for instance, we see ice ages and then more hothouse Earth scenarios. And in moving between those states, we seem to have these tipping points. There's a point at which once you go past a certain temperature, then you will inevitably fall to the next stable state. A metaphor that people often use is the idea of a ball rolling down a hill. As it starts to roll, if you run after it, you can still catch it, but once it gets to a certain point, it's going to keep on going down to its next stable state at the bottom of the hill, and there's nothing you can do about that. So we know that there are tipping points in the climate system, but we don't know exactly where they are. One of the things that the IPCC report tried to study is where the tipping points might be for different aspects of the system, like the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. And one of the reasons for trying to keep the temperature below 1.5 degrees is because we think there may be a tipping point just above 1.5 degrees, which will cause irreversible loss of those ice sheets. And the difference between that ice and the Arctic ice is that that ice is sitting on land. So when it melts, the volume of water in the sea increases, sea levels will rise. Sea levels will rise by 1, maybe 2 meters over the course of the next century. We don't know how much. There's a lot of uncertainty about the rate at which this melt will happen. But what we do know is that every time a new report comes out, it's happening faster than we thought it would do. So we're looking forward to a future in which Pacific Island states are completely submerged, coastal cities are inundated. And that's a problem because much of the world's population lives on the coast. In the UK, about a third of the population lives within 5 kilometers of the coast. So that's going to affect our population, it will affect cities like Bristol. It's one of the factors that's going to lead to climate refugees. People will simply have to move. It will also, of course, cause great economic disruption. And the estimates are something like £500 million to £1 billion a year just to deal with the UK's problems with rising sea levels. And it's not just the rising sea levels that will lead to climate refugees, it's also the warming. So the center of continents will warm more rapidly. They'll simply become too hot to live in. At a certain point, seeds won't germinate once they go past a certain temperature. And so people will have to spread out at the same time that people on the coast are spreading in. And of course, that's going to lead to a great deal of unhappiness and social problems. And one of the real concerns about this is the injustice around all this, because if you look at this map, those places that are going to be most affected and that will be affected most initially are not the countries that have burnt most of the fossil fuel and have had the economic benefits of that. It's countries in the global south. It's places like Bangladesh and Haiti and Sri Lanka that are already experiencing the terrible effects of climate change. So we're not simply talking about things happening in the future. We know that extreme weather events that are happening right now have been made much more likely because of climate change. So that is an issue of injustice. It's one that I saw recently, the Canterbury commitment that the Quakers have made, I believe it's called Minute 36, talks about the relationship between climate justice and economic justice. And that's one of the most unfair aspects of the situation we created. And when we talk about the idea that up to 1 billion people could become climate refugees, it's very difficult to really get one's head around what that means. But I think it is important for us to try to think about the human cost, to try and think of that in terms of its effects on people. So I'd like to ask MJ if she would do a reading for us. Let me introduce this. So this is a survivor account from a tropical cyclone that happened in the late 2000s in Myanmar. There's this book which provides lots of accounts from survivors, and this particular account is from a woman called Myint Myint Ai.
On the 2nd of May 2008, Myint Myint Ai, her husband and their 2 daughters, aged 3 and 6, took their boat to a nearby island to buy wood. The family lived from selling the timber in Bogali and other towns. The family planned to sleep in the boat. They saw nothing unusual in the wind, which gathered steadily through the afternoon. But by 9 p.m, it had reached a force so frightening that they abandoned their small craft for the shore and scuttled into the first house they could find. Some 25 others were already cowering there. As the cyclone approached, it drove massive waves up the vast tidal rivers that drain from the Ayeyarwady Delta into the Indian Ocean. The floodwater surged over the island where Myint Myint Ai's family were marooned, tearing the house that sheltered them from its stilt legs and driving its collapsing structure into a nearby haystack. I couldn't see anything. All I know is that people were grabbing the haystack and trying to hold on to each other as the water pulled at us. My husband and I held hands, and we each held one of the children. Cast into the water, the couple grabbed the branches of a tree, only to be swallowed up by the drifting haystack. Myint Myint Ai lost her husband's hand forever. Minutes later, she says, the realization crept over her that life was also slipping from her 3-year-old daughter, who was still in her grasp. Stricken by grief, she gave herself to the current, preferring to hold the tiny body of her daughter than to try and save herself. Although I knew that my little daughter was dead, I told myself I would never let her go. The wind and the water had been too much for her, and she became as limp as a piece of cloth. Myint Myint Ai says she slipped in and out of consciousness until fortune saw her washed up on another island. Bits of wood were piled on top of me, and I was stuck beneath them. I struggled to get out, and I realised I had let go of my child. I tried to grab her again, but could only find her leg. Then another wave hit us, and because her body was so slippery, I lost her.
Thank you, MJ. It's easier to look away, but what I want to suggest is maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should think about the realities of the situation and what they mean for the victims. And when we talk about the victims of climate change and the ecological crisis, we're not only talking about humans, we're talking about other species. Biologists talk about the era that we're living in as the Anthropocene. We are in a new era marked by the 6th mass extinction. The rate of background extinction has been exceeded by a factor of at least 20, in some cases by as much as 10,000. It's particularly scary if you read the stories lately about the insect apocalypse. Estimates of between 60 to 90% of insects have been wiped out, and that of course has an impact on all aspects of the web of life. From our perspective, insects are the base of that chain of life, but they're also important as pollinators, of course. And even where species haven't become extinct, we are driving them towards extinction. We have wiped out, since 1970, that's the year I was born, 60% of vertebrate animals have been wiped out. And again, if we try to put that in human terms, what would that mean if it was 60% of humans? Well, that would be equivalent to emptying the continents of North America, South America, Africa, Europe, China, and Oceania, so Australasia Pacific. Now, if that had happened, we would all know about it. It would be something that we would mourn every day. And yet, this is what's happened to the natural world, and my sense is that most people walking around not even aware of it. And it's not simply something that's happening elsewhere. This is happening in this country as well. 1 in 5 UK mammals are at risk of extinction within the next decade. Our birds are at risk. This Guardian article is about how in the Shetland Islands, which had been home to one of the bigger populations of puffins, the population's gone down from 33,000 to only 570 in the last census. That's what extinction looks like. You get local populations wiped out, and gradually people discover there are no more. And biologists are concerned about that because puffins, almost like the canary in the coal mine, they tell us about the health of the marine environment. So if the puffins are suffering, then that tells us about other animals as well. But quite beyond that, it's just simply heartbreaking. Puffins are one of our most well-loved birds. People have an affinity for them. They talk about them as the clown of the sea. My own affinity for puffins stems from the fact that when I was a young boy, I was an avid reader. I was a member of the Puffin Book Club. I had a little badge like this, which I wore proudly. I lived in Australia at that time, so I never saw any puffins. But I imagined that when I returned to England, that I would be able to see puffins all the time, that they would be abundant. I've never seen a puffin, maybe I never will. And in thinking about that naive, innocent child, I think about other children. I think about my own children looking at pictures of puffins in the same way that we look at dodos now, or looking at pictures of tigers in the same way that we would now look at a picture of a Tasmanian tiger. Another story that was published in The Guardian last week is about the albatross, which is also close to extinction. There are 22 species of albatross, I believe, and 20 of them are critically endangered. We know why. It's because of our industrial fishing practices these very long lines that run behind trawlers. We've known about it for a long time, but we simply refuse to change our way. The fish are getting harder to find, so people don't want to do anything that would reduce their load. And when I read about that, for me it's impossible not to think about one of the greatest poems in the English language, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in which the mariner, for reasons which are never really made clear, shoots the albatross. We don't know why, but it seems as if this is an attempt to assert dominion over the natural world. And Coleridge lets us know that that's a bad idea. The albatross is hung around the mariner's neck, and he feels shame. And that's the same kind of shame I feel when I think about what we've done to the natural world and all of the species we made extinct. Coleridge was a pantheist. He believed that by being in nature, by focusing on nature, you could be in touch with something bigger, something beyond yourself. I think he was quite inspired by the writings of William Penn, another Quakerist thought. And in the poem, the way in which the mariner receives redemption is by learning to appreciate and bless the natural world, and the albatross falls from his neck. I think maybe we can learn something from that. But the other message that Coleridge has from us in the poem is that if you lack empathy for nature, and if you act with wanton violence, there will be a price to pay. And you might say, well, what does it matter what a romantic poet thought? But I think this is the same message that we're getting from 21st century scientists, that in pushing other species to extinction, humanity is busy sawing off the limb on which it perches. We are not separate from the natural world. We cannot simply allow all other species to become extinct and think that that will have no effect on us. So that brings us on to the possibility of human extinction. And for many people, this is an idea that is completely abstract. It's impossible to imagine such a thing. But it is possible. There have been 5 previous mass extinctions, and when we look back at those, the last one was when an asteroid hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs. The previous 4, though, were all caused by the release of greenhouse gases. And the one immediately before the one that killed the dinosaurs, at the end of the Permian, that's often referred to as the Great Dying. It's estimated that 97% of species became extinct in that event. So essentially it was a fresh slate on life. And a paper that was published just in December last year is contributing to us understanding more about what happened then. So we know that there was a massive release of greenhouse gases, the planet warmed, the seas were acidified, marine life died, the phytoplankton died, and so instead of releasing oxygen, it released sulfur dioxide, and so species on land that needed oxygen died. The sulfur dioxide caused holes in the ozone layer, and so there was lots of ultraviolet radiation that killed off anything that was left. A nightmarish scenario that we could not possibly live in, and the authors of this paper point out, somewhat archly, because similar environmental alterations are predicted outcomes of current climate change, we would be wise to take note. Another paper that came out last year looked at the tipping points associated with different parts of the climate system and raised the possibility that there are correlations between these such that as we go past one tipping point, we then get sufficient warming to move to the next tipping point, and so on. So we have a cascade of tipping points like a row of dominoes falling. scientists are very worried about that. Possibly the final domino would be the permafrost melting. That would release massive quantities of methane, which is a greenhouse gas that's 20 times more potent than CO2. So we find ourselves, humanity, on this raft that we've constructed, and we're very proud of ourselves. We're conquering nature, and we're able to rule the seas. But if we zoom out, then we see that actually there's danger lying ahead. And the danger is not when we get to the very edge, it's before that. Because there is a point, a line that we can't see, beyond which it's not possible to turn around. And that's something that we have to think about. It's not that extinction is going to happen in our lifetime, but we could cross that point so that the legacy that we bequeath future generations is definite extinction that they can do nothing about. A paper published in 2017 in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences estimated that there's already a 5% chance that the CO2 that is in the atmosphere currently will cause an existential warming threat. The author said, it's like a 1 in 20 chance that the plane you're about to board will crash. We would never get on that plane, but we're willing to send our children and grandchildren on it. But even we put aside the possibility of human extinction, and I'm not saying that that's inevitable by any means, but well before that, we know that we are moving towards a world in which forest fires are more extreme and more frequent, killing humans and other animals, where water shortages are happening all the time, where there are wars over water, where the land is turning to desert, where the crops fail. And when these things happen, then inevitably we move to a state of famine. And I'd like to ask Jo if she could do another reading for us. Thank you.
"1933 was a hungry year in the Western world, yet 1933 was also a year of hunger in the Soviet cities, especially in Soviet Ukraine. In Ukraine cities, hundreds of thousands of people waited each day for a simple loaf of bread. People appeared at 2 o'clock in the morning to queue in front of shops that did not open until 7. On an average day, 40,000 people would wait for bread. Those in line were so desperate to keep their places that they would cling to the belts of those immediately in front of them. Some were so weak with hunger that they could not stand without the ballast of strangers. The waiting lasted all day and sometimes for 2. Pregnant women and maimed war veterans had lost their right to buy out of turn and had to wait in line with the rest if they wanted to eat. Somewhere in line, a woman would wail, and the moaning would echo up and down the line so that whole groups of thousands sounded like a single animal with an elemental fear. Survival was a moral as well as a physical struggle. A woman doctor wrote to a friend in June 1933 that she had not yet become a cannibal, but was not sure that I shall not be one by the time my letter reaches you. The good people died first. Those who refused to steal or to prostitute themselves died. Those who gave food to others died. Those who refused to eat corpses died. Those who refused to kill their fellow men died. Parents who resisted cannibalism died before their children did.
So my point here is that when we think about the implications of climate change, we shouldn't think just about the dangers of what our climate system may do to us, but also about what we may do to each other as water and food and other resources become scarce. And the IPCC report doesn't limit itself to talking about the natural world. It talks about social consequences. It talks about scenario 3, which is effectively business as usual, leading to high levels of public unrest, political destabilization, resulting in some countries becoming dysfunctional. And this is a breeding ground for fascism. And often we like to think that the events of the 1930s were just an aberration that could never happen again. But I think it would be naive to believe that humanity has transcended all of these problems. And if one looks at some of the early warning signs of fascism that are listed here, I think you might agree that there are one or two of them that we already see. So where are we then? Let's take stock. In 1957, American scientists started to get really concerned about this large-scale geophysical experiment that we were doing. And that was the first year that we started continuously monitoring CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and in every year since then, the levels have risen. In 1990, we had our first IPCC meeting, and the scientists warned that strong, quite radical measures were necessary to keep warming below 1 degree Celsius, but that it was essential that we do so to avoid the risk of societal collapse. And we're now at 1 degree above pre-industrial levels. In 1997, we had the Kyoto meeting, and we agreed legally binding emissions to start to reduce CO2 emissions. And there was much rejoicing, and emissions continued to go up. In 2001, so just a few years later, the US decided that they would renounce the Kyoto Protocol. George Bush was worried that it would be bad for the economy. And emissions continued to rise. In 2006, in this country, we had the Stern Report, which showed that actually the consequences of not tackling climate change, the economic consequences, far exceeded those of trying to mitigate now. So from a purely economic perspective, it makes no sense not to do everything we can to reduce CO2 emissions. And so the government said that's an excellent report, and CO2 emissions continued to rise. In 2015, we had the Paris Agreement, and we agreed that we would keep warming well below 2 degrees and aim for 1.5 degrees. And again, there was much rejoicing, and CO2 emissions continued to rise. And in 2018, emissions have increased in that year alone by a further 2.7%. So since 1990, when we had that first IPCC report, we have dumped more CO2 into the atmosphere than in all of the years of human history prior to 1990. So it really seems like we cannot break this habit. We cannot get off fossil fuel. But of course, even if it doesn't immediately affect us in rich Western countries, it will do eventually. It's our children and our grandchildren and their children who will pay the price. And we've known this for a very long time. So just today I came across this quote from 1772. I believe this is in the Quaker Faith and Practice book. John Woolman said, "The produce of the earth is a gift from our gracious Creator to the inhabitants, and to impoverish the earth now to support outward greatness appears to be an injury to the succeeding age." Well, wise words. We've known this for a long time. Now, I'm not a climate scientist. What I've been telling you about is not controversial. It's the science that's in the IPCC report, and it's based on other scientific articles from the leading scientific journals. So there's nothing controversial about this. But I'm glad I'm not a climate scientist, because to be one is to have to spend your time documenting and recording a slow-motion disaster. Kate Marvel is a climate scientist who works for NASA. She studies the impacts of climate change. And here's something she said recently. As a climate scientist, I'm often asked to talk about hope. Particularly in the current political climate, audiences want to be told that everything will be all right in the end. Climate change is bleak, the organisers always say. Tell us a happy story. Give us hope. The problem is, I don't have any. It's natural for us to look away from things that are scary, to avoid thinking about our own mortality, for instance. But there's something about this problem, the scale and the speed with which it's happening, which means that we really are all in this together. And maybe that's something that we can take some comfort from. It is healthy for us to start this grieving process so that we can move away from denial and try to have courage rather than hope to face up to what's ahead. Whatever is coming, we can make it better. Yes, we have to face, there are things we've already lost. There are things that we inevitably will lose because of the effects that are already locked into the system. But still, there is much for us to hold on to. So I'd like to ask you to take a minute just to reflect silently on what we've talked about the lives that have already been lost, what has been lost, and I promise that the second part of this talk will be much more upbeat. Thank you very much. I'd like to encourage you to turn to your neighbour and check in with them, find out how they're feeling. And maybe we'll spend a couple of minutes doing that, and then Tom is going to tell us about what we can do.
Okay, so thank you, Colin, for that. Now, I'd just like to ask you all a question. Who's feeling upset after all of that? I am? Yeah? Who's feeling angry? Who's feeling afraid? Okay, and I want you to keep your hands up for this last one. Who's feeling like they want to do something about it? Good. Okay, so that is where we come in. The Extinction Rebellion, with our 3 key demands. Demand number 1 is tell the truth, declare a climate emergency. Demand number 2, is to enact legally binding policies to achieve carbon neutrality by the year 2025. And then demand number 3 is to put in place a citizens' assembly which will direct our way out of this climate crisis. Now, a citizens' assembly is not something I'm an expert on. I have watched the TED Talk. It is very good. But in essence, it is a randomly selected representative body of the population that is informed with all of the best information, given both sides of the argument, and then comes to an impartial decision based upon that. Now, this was proven to work in Ireland in their campaign to repeal the 8th Amendment, and has been in the mainstream media recently about how we can break the Brexit deadlock. It is an idea in putting into place a citizens' assembly. Now, you might be thinking, why do we need a citizens' assembly? What's wrong with our current government? What's wrong with our current government system? Well, we're not thinking that. This was pitched for a Conservative club. So if we look at the government's record, they approved the Heathrow Expansion, the 3rd runway, which will result in 7.3 million tonnes of CO2 a year being pumped into the atmosphere, which is the carbon equivalent of Cyprus. They also forced fracking onto communities which voted against fracking and did not want it there, and they did that with all of your money. So, brings us to the question, what do you do when your government is driving extinction events and gassing the world's citizens? Well, maybe it could depend on your political perspective. We hear the idea of a rebellion or revolution, and you think that's classic left wing, classic anarchists. It's the usual subjects. But in the issue of climate change, from a liberal perspective, climate change poses an immense threat to both personal freedoms and property rights. As Colin said before, the conditions we're looking at are a breeding ground for authoritarian government, and sea level rise will result in thousands of properties around the UK and other countries being destroyed. Now, a philosopher called John Locke coined a phrase that political philosophers call the right to revolution. When the legislators endeavour to take away and destroy the property of the people, they put themselves into a state of war with those people, who are thereupon abolished of any further obedience, and are left to the common refuge which God has provided for all men against force and violence. By this breach of trust, they forfeit the power the people had put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and this power devolves to the people, who have a right to resume their original liberties. Similarly, if we look at the issues from a conservative perspective, climate change is directly opposed to an idea of conservation due to the immense threats to both security and order posed by climate change. The Pentagon in 2014 stated that climate change posed an immediate risk to the way that the US military goes around its missions, and climate change has been described as a threat multiplier. Everything from refugee crisis to infectious disease. Now, regardless of your political ideology, you have a right to rebel against our inept government that only serves to further the moral crisis that we find ourselves in. So we are looking for people who don't want to stand by, but are willing to stand up. And if we look through history, we have amazing examples of individuals who were willing to do just that. If we look at Gandhi, he used non-violent resistance methods to throw off 200 years of British colonial rule in India. If we look at Martin Luther King, his non-violent resistance movement ended segregation in the South and resulted in a civil rights bill being enshrined into law. You might think that's all very well and good. Non-violent methods, well, they've worked in the past. But now, everyone, they're all just the usual suspects. It's hippies and anarchists. Now, John Lennon thought that non-violent methods were the only way of beating the state. And you might think he's a dreamer, but he's not the only one. Erica Chenoweth did a study on over 300 rebellions and revolutions over the past 100 years and found that not only were non-violent methods twice as successful as violent methods, but of every violent revolution, only 1 in 20 hadn't descended into some form of authoritarian rule within 5 years. Now, you might think that to implement social change, we must have an overwhelming majority of the population on our side. You might think we need 90% or 50% or 10%. But in fact, from this research, no campaign failed once they had achieved the active and sustained participation of just 3.5% of the population. If we look at the Egyptian revolution, where only 1 million people gathered into Tahrir Square, which is only 5% of the local population and around 1% of the Egyptian population, and they were able to achieve regime change within under 2 weeks. Now, 3.5% of the UK population is around 2.5 million people. But we can bring about massive social change with much smaller numbers of people who are willing to do more or are willing to sacrifice more. A really good example of this is the Freedom Riders. College students in America who rode buses into the South in the 60s and did not abide by the segregation rules for the buses. Now, they were arrested, as you can see. They were beaten. They were imprisoned. But within a very small amount of time, only a few hundred of these people were able to end segregation on the buses. So if we look at non-violent action and things which make it work, how do we go about taking action? Well, first of all, it's got to be respectful. Now, it's got to be respectful because we don't want to alienate people. We don't want to create an us and a them. There is only us. We're all facing the same crisis. There is no other in this context. And also, that ideally we want to be getting the government to the negotiation table. And that will be much easier given it coming from a place of mutual respect. It's got to be disruptive. You've got to make people notice. So this is the 17th of November bridges in London. But you've got to make people notice. You have to disrupt business as usual. People can't keep going around their daily lives. People need to be made aware of what's happening. It's got to be sacrificial. You have to see people being able to give up their liberty. The act of seeing someone who willingly gives up something that is precious to them, such as their freedom, is powerful, and it drives emotion, and it brings people, and it brings sympathy to the movement and to the cause. We have Nelson Mandela, who spent 30 years in prison for his beliefs that apartheid was wrong. He was released, and apartheid is now ended in South Africa. But last, and potentially the most important element of a non-violent resistance movement is this idea behind backfiring. Backfiring is essentially when the state cracks down on peaceful protesters. So if you haven't seen the Children's March on YouTube, I would recommend that you go home, and when you go home, you watch the Children's March. But in the 60s in America, the children in the schools, the black children, decided that they'd had enough, and they left school and marched through the streets. And the police didn't know what to do, so they just arrested them all, held them for a bit, and then let them go. The next day, the children do the same thing. They march through the streets, all get arrested, then all get released. And then this kept happening until the chief of police basically just had enough and said, which one's the... use the fire hose on them. So the American police and the firemen just opened fire hoses at children, some as young as 4, in the streets. Now these pictures hit the American media, and people all over the US were in absolute outcry. How can this be happening in our greatest country on earth? How can this be happening in the freest, best place in the whole world, that we are attacking children in the streets? And within, I think it was around 2 days of this happening, Kennedy addresses the nation and said that he was going to sign a civil rights bill into law, that this would not stand in the United States of America. So what is happening now, currently? We have Greta Thunberg, climate hero number 1, who is my personal hero. And she, back in May, or March, one of the two, she sat outside the Swedish Parliament every day, every Friday, and held out leaflets, and she was on school strike. And she was telling them why. I'm on school strike for climate. And people, they didn't take her seriously. But then, gained some traction. And now we have Greta Thunberg speaking truth to power in the UN COP24, where she calls out the world leaders and says that they are stealing their children's future, who they claim to love. And I just love that image of this, because she's really short, this little girl, and she looks so like frail, and she's just speaking truth to the most powerful men and women in the entire world. We have the school strikes going on currently. So these are pictures from the school strikes in Australia. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. The school strikes in Australia. Now, there's currently school strikes going on in Belgium, Switzerland, France, Germany, and next week, next Friday, they're going to be starting in the UK. Yeah, hooray indeed. Hooray indeed. You definitely should encourage your grandchildren. That's your homework. And see, we've got some very creative signs. So, what is rising up? What do we do? Where do we fit into this? Where does Extinction Rebellion fit into this? So we're an organisation that we're fairly established. We've been around for a few years. This is some of our earlier mischief on the Vote No Heathrow campaign. We have principles and values, such as our non-violent discipline and our ideas behind regenerative culture. We've got a strategy, a set of tactics, and we have a theory about how we will achieve change. And here is potentially one of my favourite pictures of all time, outside of Barclays on a divestment campaign. Now, as I'm sure some of you are aware, last autumn we got into a lot of trouble. We did lots of naughty things. So outside Downing Street, before the bridges, these two women, and she is from a group called Christian Climate Action. They glued themselves to the rails and they were both arrested. We also held a funeral procession to Buckingham Palace, and then we gave the Queen an impassioned speech about how she needs to step forward and save the realm. So we really have, we've broken the mould of ordinary campaigning. We had mass acts of civil disobedience. 86 people were arrested on one day last year, and we had around 6,000 people blocking the bridges in London. And that's the autumn before last, 4 people deliberately, briefly went to prison. So this is an example of a campaign of ours which was very successful. Now, universities around the UK had investment in fossil fuel companies. Now, in universities, as Colin knows, the process around everything is very slow. It's like, will you divest? Oh, we'll think about it. We'll have a meeting, we'll do a review of some evidence, and then we'll have a meeting to see if that can be sent to the normal meeting, and all this layers and layers of bureaucracy. And it was taking years. And this campaign to get them to divest had been going on for around 2 years. And then Roger Hallam gets involved, and he's like, why aren't they divesting? So what he does is he sprays on the outside of King's College, and then they kick him out of the school. And people say, no, you can't do that. You can't kick him out for that. So they let him back in. And he keeps causing trouble. So he goes on a hunger strike, and then they kick him out. And then everyone's like, you can't kick someone out for going on hunger strike. So they have to let him back in. And within about 7 weeks of this starting, King's College divests. Because he just wouldn't leave them alone. So then the students in Cardiff University, they got wind of this, and they thought, we can do that. So then they did the exact same. And within only a few weeks, Cardiff University also divested from fossil fuels. And then Bristol University saw that this was happening and thought, oh, we better divest as well. So no one had to break a sweat. So here we have, what have I... So, in our campaigning, people do get arrested. People are willingly arrested. Phil, here, had to try 5 times in October to get arrested. Because he would lie down in the road, and then the police would pick him up and put him on the side. And then he'd just get up, walk in, and lie back down. And they kept doing this until they just had enough and they put him in the van. That is me outside Bristol Magistrates Court, and they couldn't arrest me quick enough, to be honest. But
And yeah, so I sprayed, and there instantly just millions of police, and that was that. But it was all worth it for the really that photo. This is from our most recent action in Bristol, where on a day similar to this, pouring in rain, we held a large march and a die-in, and then we redecorated DEFRA, just kind of helped them get into the Christmas spirit. And yours truly, Colin, there he is. He had to try very hard to get arrested, didn't you? Very hard indeed. So, if any of you are wondering, when you are arrested, well, or when I was arrested, they basically just put you in a cell, which is very echoey, not very comfortable, leave you there for a few hours, and then give you some disgusting food. And then they let you out, and friends there, and then they pick you up, and that's it. And it's really not that bad. But it is boring. It's quite a good opportunity to get some reading done, maybe a bit of meditation, you know, all the above, do some yoga. But it is important that, and I want to stress this, that if you want to be part of Extinction Rebellion, then you absolutely do not need to be arrested. Now, only a few people in exile get arrested. We need people to support us in any way you could possibly imagine. Whether that's sharing a Facebook post, it's better than nothing, or like flyering or doing some sticking, or maybe just telling your grandchildren about the upcoming climate strike, then that's all the types of support that we need. So this is just some of the roles which are in. Can't read any of it from the back. Can't read it. I can read it out. So we have okay, so basically anything you could imagine within XR, you can do. So we need people to do arts. We need people who want to learn how to give these talks, learn how to give trainings. We need people who are good at finance. We need people who like doing media, people who want to plan actions, people that want to do research, and people that want to lobby, counsellors, and things like that. Whatever you could possibly imagine, we are more than happy to have your skills. So what is our plan? Well, our plan is quite simple. We're going to give talks like this and trainings all across the country. And then on April the 15th, hopefully, tens of thousands of people are going to pile in to London and pile in to capital cities all around the world and just make a nuisance of themselves. And then if that doesn't work, we're going to do it again a few months later and again. And hopefully every time there will be more people and there will be more media and there will be more everything. And then soon enough, we will achieve our goals. Now, this is the most fun part of the talk. Basically, could you please give us your details, which my lovely assistant our lovely assistants will hand you. We will log your information in a GDPR compliant way. Okay, so just one final thing, or a few final things, but we have in our culture in the UK, the majority of the way that we are taught to think about things is from a utilitarian orientation, which is, if I do this, then that's good because this will happen. Now, in the context of the climate crisis, we believe that it's good to think about it's more important to think about things from the service orientation, where you ask yourself, what do I need to do to be a good person? What do I need to do so that I'll be able to look my children or my grandchildren in the eye and not think that I've wronged them? Now, we have a passage that I would like to read to you. Firmly establish your intention to live your life for the healing of the world. Be conscious of it, honor it, and nurture it every day. Be fully present in our time. Find the courage to breathe in the suffering of the world. Allow peace and healing to breathe out through you in return. Do not meet power on its own terms. See through to its real nature, mind and heart made. Lead your response from that level. Simplify. Clear away the dead wood in your life. Look for the heartwood and give it the first call on your time, the best of your energy. Put down the leaden burden of saving the world alone. Join with others of like mind. Align yourself with the forces of resolution. Hold in a single vision, in the same thought, the transformation of yourself and the transformation of the world. Live your life around that edge, always keeping it in sight. As a bird flies on two wings, balance outer activity with inner sustenance. Follow your heart, realize your gifts, cultivate them with diligence to offer knowledge and skill to the world. Train in non-violence of body, speech, and mind. With great patience with yourself, learn to make beautiful each action, word, and thought. In a crucible of meditation, bring forth day by day into your own heart the treasury of compassion, wisdom, and courage for which the world longs. Sit with hatred until you feel the fear beneath it. Sit with fear until you feel the compassion beneath that. Do not set your heart on particular results. Enjoy positive action for its own sake, and rest confident that it will bear fruit. When you see violence, greed, or narrow-mindedness in the fullness of its power, walk straight into the heart of it, remaining open to the sky and in touch with the earth. Staying open, staying grounded. Remember that you are the inheritor of the strengths of thousands of generations of life. Staying open, staying grounded. Recall that the thankful prayers of future generations are silently with you. Staying open, staying grounded. Be confident in the magic and power that arise when people come together in a great cause. Staying open, staying grounded, know that the deep forces of nature will emerge to the aid of those who defend the earth. Staying open, staying grounded. Have faith that the higher forces of wisdom and compassion will manifest through our actions for the healing of the world. When you see weapons of hate, disarm them with love. When you see armies of greed, meet them in the spirit of sharing. When you see a fortress of narrow-mindedness, breach them with the truth. And when you find yourself enshrouded in dark clouds of dread, dispel them with fearlessness. When forces of power seek to isolate us from each other, reach out with joy. In it all and through it all, holding to your intention, let go in the music of life and dance. Thank you very much.
I'd like to say a massive thank you to Tom and Professor Colin Davies. It's been a really interesting, sobering, but very interesting, and hopefully it will get more people to join the 3.5%. For me, it's given me a bit of hope that together we really can make a difference. So please take a flyer when you come out, please sign up, and there will be more information on other talks and so on the Redland Quaker meeting site. But can we give a big, big thanks to these two? But he got a £900 fine for spraying chalk paint on a window, which I would love it if people could dig deep, and we got plates here, there, to try and pay back some of that fine so he can carry on being rebellious for all us. Yeah.